This is a Global Skills Podcast, conversations that shape the future of work and learning. We're exploring how we close the skills gap and build a future where everyone has the chance to thrive. From education to business, connecting people, ideas, and opportunities that drive change. It's about collaboration, curiosity, and creating real impact today. Because every skill learned brings us one step closer to a more inclusive world. The Global Skills Podcast, where learning and opportunity come together. Today on the Global Skills Podcast, we welcome Franz Gilbert, Global Growth Leader for Human Capital Strategy and Innovation at Deloitte. Franz doesn't just talk about the future of work, he builds the bridges to it. From leading global human capital strategy to advising the HR tech ecosystem on AI, alliances and innovation, Franz operates at the intersection of talent, technology and transformation. He served on the board of HRCI, advised startups through SAP.io, and helped shape global HR standards at ISO level. That's just not just experience, it's the real infrastructure. In this episode, we're going to dive into really what agentic AI really means for talent ecosystems, how HR leaders can stay ahead as AI native challengers reshape the market, and the global regulatory puzzle of gig work and autonomous agents. Franz has a rare ability to zoom out to 30,000 feet and then land the plane with practical clarity. There's a moment in every industry where you either react to change or you design it. This conversation is about being the designer. You're very welcome to the podcast, Franz.
Oh, Vanessa, as always, thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it, and I look forward to talking with you and also for the listeners.
Well, with every guest, I love to start with understanding how did you end up in the role that you're in today? Because it really is a hybrid of so many elements, but at the heart is talent.
Yeah, so this is where I'm kind of a student and also an example of great HR theory, which is I'm incredibly blessed to be doing what I know, what I love, and what my passion is, right? I mean, I think everyone's probably read the book about Ikigai in terms of the Japanese methodology, but it's just a great example of HR. The quick example is you would have never predicted my career path. It wasn't a normal one, but we also know about 80% of people that are in HR did not come originally starting in HR, right? It's that the normal path. So quick version for me is I was at Circus City stores for years and I was doing strategy and innovation for them, but it was all retail focused. And there, what I walked away with is an understanding of not only technology, but more importantly, how important people are to business models. Simplistic, but it was an incredibly important learning. And then I had to go to the chance to be in the outsourcing world for HR. I was at Exalt and Hewitt Associates, firms that no longer exist today. And I really got to understand how all of HR connects together. It was an amazing opportunity to see all the towers, both from a systems but operations standpoint and what it did to the employee experience. And then lastly, I had some amazing opportunities to spend time at firms helping build out how they were thinking about their next level of technology. And then I had the chance to come to Deloitte. And it was the perfect mix of all the roles where I get a chance to see what clients are looking from an HR perspective. I get to lead what our strategy and innovation plans are going to be. And then sitting on the board, I get to see where the profession's going. So I've just got this really blessed vantage point to be able to see what everyone's working on. And I will tell you, it's an amazing time to be in the HR profession. And I also know it's an incredibly tough time to be in the HR profession. 80% of HR is what we call HR of one. It's one person, usually a shop that's 200 people or less. And so too often our days are just buried in how do I do payroll? How do I do time off, right? And I will tell you, at the same time, everyone's doing all that work. The tools and what we're doing for employees is advancing significantly. So I appreciate you asking, but I know I have a sincere opportunity to help serve the profession even more.
I think it's really interesting how you mentioned there sort of the humans at the heart. HR have always played a role that once recruitment happens, they kind of take the hand of the employee and look after them through their journey with that company. And L&D has operated at the side, but the more interviews I'm doing, the more people that I'm talking to, I'm realizing that actually L&D, talent and recruitment, they're all coming together. What are you experiencing? And do you think that's the right model where these people systems start pulling together?
I think there's an amazing consolidations that's happening. You and I've had the pleasure of talking before, and I have a chance to look at it from a market perspective, right? What do we see the HR providers and things happening? And there's two intersections kind of happening simultaneously. One is the learning and development profession, just from an instructional design perspective, has known for years that learning in the flow of work is the best instructional design theory. right? How do you get the right data, the right insights to the right individual at the right time? So that, from an academic and from a learning science, IO psych perspective, is known. The challenge is, how do you execute it? How do you have contextual awareness of what the person's doing, what the work they're working on, and how do you inject that? And when you do that, because if you think about it, otherwise, what happens is L&D becomes its own silo, right? People come to them. I'm going to go take a class. I'm going to go take a course. When you start doing it in the flow of work, learning and development starts becoming very embedded in operations. And so as a result, the silo of that function quickly disappears. And I know there's always a debate of, where should L&D sit? Is it HR, ops, both? And now what we're seeing is the technology is starting to get contextual awareness, right? Where it's starting to understand, you're in this HRM system or this, ERP system. Here's how you should do accounts payable, or you're in a sales CRM. Here's something you should know about a product for this customer. We're starting to see that in the flow of work, training design, and content development. And so it is kind of a magical time to be in L&D, because out of all the functions, it's also the one adopting AI the fastest, right? Because it's one of the functions that's the least regulated. So they're playing with personalized training. They're doing bespoke content generation. That's a fun area to play in right now.
Okay, so if L&D is the magic area, and I agree with you, and that's such a good point that you say the regulation, it'll build, I'm sure. But for now, who owns the skills for a strategy within a company then?
I'm laughing because it used to be there was a fun expression that, who owns the job description? And it takes a village to own a job description. Because you have recruiting saying I have to have a market-friendly job description, one that makes sense, right? You'd have compensation saying, I have to design a role that makes sense from a regulatory standpoint. Like in the US, we have to do FLSA testing. You have to do compensation benchmarking, right? So compensation is heavily involved. Learning and development wants to know what's going on with the job, so you understand what the task analysis is going to be, right, in terms of the instructional design. And so everyone was involved, right? And that's one of the problems that happen with skills. If you go back, and I'm dating myself, but about 12 years ago, everyone was going through the skills taxonomy journey, right? It was just, what are skills? What's a taxonomy? How do we think about it? And so there were a number of firms that just sold taxonomies, right? That's what they did. The first firms that started embedding skills in their platforms was learning and development. So, I think we all know our primary ones. Deloitte has alliances with like Cornerstone and Workday and, Docebo. All of them have skills taxonomies built inside their system. And one, it made brilliant sense because they could personalize the learning path, right? They could say, if you didn't have this skill, what do I recommend? It was a recommendation engine. The second thing then that happened is the industry realized, oh, wait a minute. If I've got skills, this becomes this major data problem for the longest time, because you've got a taxonomy of 65,000 plus skills. Every individual has different skills, right? If you're doing it at an individual level versus a rec perspective. So how do you pass the data? And you couldn't. So the learning market went, we have an opportunity to be the kind of the skills system of record, right? And just from an ARR perspective or contracting perspective, made them more sticky. Product managers in the industry saw that. And so there was kind of a race as to who could be the best system of record. And so that's where the HRM system started putting skills in there. So now you've got talent management systems, learning development systems, HRMs that all have the ability to store skills. And they do it in different ways, right? Some are employee profiles, some are job descriptions, some are both. But the industry's almost done getting to where you can pass data back and forth, right? So finally, it took about 3 years for the industry to kind of do open APIs around it. And there's a couple of firms, one of which is out of Belgium, that we all know and love, that becomes that middleware layer, right? How do you pass skills data between systems, normalize it? So I think at this point, it's finally gotten back to everyone. Right. Yeah. Because I think before, to answer your question, historically, it was like whatever HR function owned that system, they were kind of the owners of the skills topology and how it worked. Now, I think it's started hopefully getting to the point where it's almost invisible inside the system. I know that was a longer answer to your question, but I think there's this amazing chronology that I want people to appreciate, how the technology market has tried to respond to what the HR functions needed.
I think it's really interesting because there's many use cases for what you described. I mean, full disclosure, that we operate in this space when it comes to skills ontology and exchange. And what's interesting, I think it's quite apt to bring up, say, the defense industry right now, which is really lacking in skills, but yet there are many transferable skills from other industries such as auto. What role do you think companies play in this like massive skills gap that's been created in defense, in green, in trying to upskill, reskill to fill these gaps? Or maybe it's the role of government, but I'd love to get your macro view on this.
I think at the end of the day, the biggest lift is going to be, and we're starting to see this happen. And this is some of the amazing work you and your firm are doing, right? Because people are like, okay, if a company knows skills, right, that's fantastic, but it's within their walls, right? They are, from a profit perspective, motivated to do the right things for their shareholders, right? So as a result, they're going to control their taxonomies. People started looking at wallets, right? Going, well, how do I make skills transferable across companies? From a commercial perspective, that didn't make a lot of sense, right? If I'm Acme Incorporated, why do I want to make my employees' skills transferable to Acme company number two, right? So the private sector has been kind of running around with this wallet idea for about 10 years, and it never took off because the incentives didn't make sense. What's really neat to see is the public sector is now coming into play. Right. And that's where I really think what's going to be the biggest lift on skills is the skills wallets. And you hear learning education records, LERs, right? There's a variety of terms for it. The EU is doing some amazing work with that you've been involved in. That is where I think finally the commercial pieces of it are going to go away. And it's what can we do to upskill our workforce, right? And their governments are going to be able to do this best, right? So in the United States, Alabama did a great example of this where they were trying to upskill over 100,000 people, right? And they all had skills wallet and they were tracking it. But we're now seeing, the EU has been working on skills portability and working with some of the higher ed, the university school systems, this time. And it's fun to see that. That's where I think we're going to get the biggest lift out of this. And then we are seeing governments talk to us going, once I have this, can companies then tap into it? And that makes perfect sense, right? Because if I am a citizen in a region or a state or a country, and an employer could opt in and get my data and bring it in saying, okay, I know all the skills that they have, that becomes now more interesting for the companies, right? Because then they can build on it and then they can feed it back. So I think that's going to be that next stage we're starting to see.
Yeah, it's really a game changer for foreign direct investment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Quick question. Do you actually know what skills exist across your organizations today? Or are decisions still being made on job titles, CVs, and assumptions around who can be reskilled and upskilled? You see, as AI reshapes work and organizations really face that pressure to cut costs, the real challenge isn't just skills gaps. It's understanding which skills are transferable and which can be redeployed into the future with a bit of upskilling. So for the listeners of Global Skills Podcast, Abodu, our sponsor, has created this free Skills AI readiness assessment. It gives leaders clarity in just 3 minutes. It shows skills gaps, automation exposure, and where future-ready capabilities already exist within your business. No data upload, no preparation, just clarity for the future of your organization. Visit abodu.com/global skills podcast. Now, back to the episode.
Okay. So I know part of our audience as well are S&B leaders. They may not have the budgets of the large enterprise where, you have a whole workforce supporting transition with AI. I'd love to get your insights as to your predictions around, we're now in this human stroke automation world. We're heading towards human agent, humanoid world. Please tell me any predictions you can share. And then for the S&B leaders, what can they do to prepare for what feels like the unknown?
Wow. So the other day, it was absolutely fascinating. I saw a site, it's been in the news. There was a social network site that came up for agents to talk to agents, right? So that was fascinating in and of itself. And then last week, a new site got launched that allows agents to hire humans, and which was just fascinating, right? Going, have we already gotten to this point where you can think about it, but imagine a company telling an agent, an AI agent saying, okay, you've got a budget of 100 euros to go do X, right? And the agent can think through and say, okay, I can self-build, 3 agents, sub-agents to go do X, Y, Z, but there's a human component. I need to go hire somebody. Let me go hire them to do it. You can quickly see and envision a world where the agents can self-govern and maybe go do that, which is just fascinating. I mean, it raises all sorts of questions. Obviously, we all know, what are we doing in contract workers, gig workers, kind of the legal compliance, the worker classification stuff. But let's presume all that kind of disappears. But you kind of go back to your question from an SMB perspective, what does it mean? I think the biggest piece that's going to change fastest for SMBs is historically, SMBs have been much more direct employee relationships, right? It's, I hire 10 people, but they are full-time employees. I think the SMBs are going to very quickly have to understand, how do you use contractors and gig workers and freelance in a much bigger vantage point of saying, okay, how do you build a 40-person company, but only 10 may be employees? And that takes a lot of forethought, right? If you are an executive of a company and looking to grow it, take advantage of this to figure out how you architect your operations differently because there are some regulatory issues. But the good news is also for the SMBs, it varies by country, some caps, right? But if you are a really small SMB, you actually don't have to worry about some of the caps. But that's the piece I would think through, is saying, okay, be very specific on the skills that you need. And then instead of hiring a person, go use those point pieces of, I just need a contractor to go get this one skill, and it may be, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months.
So is it a case of, God, I'm going to give my age away here, but a blank piece of paper and literally a pen going, okay, let's start my whole flow, work system, design model from scratch? Or should leaders for another year or so just tweak, automate this, put an agent in there? Or are we the ones that are going to be competitive in the future? Should they be redesigning their entire models at this point in time?
That's a fun question. My wife runs a small medium business, and it's been fascinating because I actually think this is now the time where SMBs actually can even the playing ground with much bigger firms. So MIT a couple of years ago at their MTech was kind of predicting we're going to see the first $1 billion one-person firm, right? We're going to see a top 10 hit that is done by AI. Well, the top 10 hit by AI has already happened in the US. It was 100% AI generated. So we're starting to see that. So if I'm an SMB, SMBs can adopt AI tools faster, right? If you think about normal enterprises, large enterprises that, the Deloittes of the world serve, typically we have much bigger issues that make firms have to adopt AI slower, right? Cybersecurity, governance, IP control, right? There's a lot of mechanics that have to be put in place if you're running an operation of 30,000 people, right? You got to make sure everyone understands the playground rules on how we're using AI. If you're an SMB, you can be much more nimble in how fast you're adopting the technology. And so as a result, SMBs can do things faster with AI than enterprises, right? So you kind of go, one, the adoption curve is bigger. Two, the value realization is much bigger on AI now than historically it was, right? So there's much more incentive for an SMB to go explore and figure out, can I automate my accounts payable, right? Can I automate, my lead generation? I mean, it's just fascinating what can be done. I mean, I'll give you an example of a piece of software I saw that, it's not enterprise grade, but it's SMB grade, where you literally could put in a topic, right? It magically creates a course, creates the content, and it then creates the social media campaign for people to come in and try to take the course for some sort of value. And it was all in one step. And it was just fascinating to see all this piece together. So I'm actually excited for SMBs because I think they're the ones that can reinvent themselves the quickest.
I think you're right. It does level the playing field. Even from an outreach perspective, I know there's lots of digital marketing agencies that are leveraging AI. It's a game changer. If I could jump up again back to a macro viewpoint, because I've kind of always operated from the perspective of we've got government here, education here, industry here. And the gap has been widening between education and industry. If we take school, the challenges universities are now facing. I mean, if industry can barely keep up on top of the skills that are required, how do universities and secondary education do that? So that gap, have you any viewpoints on what companies and education can do to sort of bridge that gap in the coming years?
There's one way I think the gap is going to be bridged. It's another where I don't know anybody knows the answer yet. So the gap that can be bridged, actually, this is why I'm a huge fan of skills wallets. Because that becomes the common currency between the two, is if you've got the skills wallets, it allows governments to start to understand what's the skills demand inside the commercial environment. And that data we all know exists. I mean, we can all see what skills people are hiring for. We know in enterprises, like at Deloitte, we get a feed of every job posted in the G20 every single day, right? So we know the skills on a real-time basis, what's being hired. Imagine then a government being able to pull that exact same data set and then compare it to what's your workforce readiness look like. So I think that's going to connect, because then that'll drive the education group saying, hey, listen, we're seeing a lot of people that needing X. Now, the challenge is the velocity, right, at which the skills are disappearing. So I think part one of your question is, I think the skills records are going to help uniform that. The gap, though, that the challenge that the higher education and the education world is going to have is if skills are moving at such a high velocity and you've got AI that's changing our pedagogies, right? It used to be, what do you know is important. Well, AI is now changing that pedagogy, that it does what we know is no longer important. AI does it. We're getting back to critical thinking, liberal arts training, human relational skills. That's going to change how schools have to think about their curriculums and how they teach. And that's a very different thing, because on the one hand, you'll be going, okay, for the first time ever, I know Acme Incorporated needs, 15 agile programmers, right? And hypothetically, education groups could go through and say, I'm going to produce 15 agile programmers. But at the same time, the education world is having to figure out, actually, I need to do less of that, and I need to do more of critical thinking skills, right? And so I think that may actually increase a gap, but for the right reasons. But it'll be fascinating to see what professionals in the education world come up with on what does education look like 5 years from now in a world of AI.
We touched on humanoids, which that's fascinating to me. And the question I have is, if you could wave a magic wand and anything could happen in terms of the evolution of humanoids, what is the future workplace?
In terms of humanoid robotics. So I think for the listeners, I have the pleasure of helping lead our humanoid robotics practice for Deloitte in the US. And it's amazing watching the progression of what's happening with those types of robots. And we're starting to hit the stage where contract manufacturing is starting to happen. So we are going to start seeing them more in the workforce over the 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Now, there's a lot of social media hype that's saying it's going to be much bigger than it is. The reality is it's going to take longer, and it has nothing to do with the tech's not ready. There's a manufacturing capacity issue, stuff like that. The piece that excites me the most there is it allows us to take tasks that historically were dangerous and allow robots to do that. So think electrical line inspections, right? Safety checks in chemical vats, right? There's a lot of jobs that we have where humans are at risk that we can train robots to go do. So that's kind of piece number one. The second thing that excites me about, as companies think about robotics is we know we're going to have labor shortages, right? It varies by country what the deficit's going to be. Europe, depending on what the retirement age is going to be, has a 5 to 10% labor deficit projected out for the next 5 years. And it's just demographic. In which case you go, well, how do I use, like in a hospital setting, using robots to do material transport and taking things from point A to point B instead of having medical staff that, are incredibly scarce, having them run things around, right? Let's have them focus on patient care, right? It's much more valuable. So I think that's going to be the second thing that I want people to think about when it comes to humanoid robotics is how do we use the robotics to do the tasks that we really don't want to be doing or from a labor shortage perspective can't be doing and allow humans to do that much more. Because the piece that I love the most, and it's both AI and robots, is at some point in, that's the next 5, 10 years, all of us are going to be using AI. All of us are going to have robots. In which case we get back to, well, what's your competitive differentiation? If we're all using the same AI models and we've all got similar robots, well, what makes it different is the humans. And that gets us back to where are we going to be doing our critical thinking, right? And how do we think about our competitive differentiation, which is the thing that excites me the most about what's going on.
The school principal said to me yesterday, Vanessa, it's like going back to the 90s. Where it's about critical thinking, communication, human skills, before we had the tech that we have today. And we have a closing tradition for the podcast where I ask 2 questions. You can answer one or both, up to you. Question 1, is there a skill you had when you were younger that you use that you don't use anymore that you'd like to? And if so, why? And the second is for any, I suppose, mid-career professionals that are listening that perhaps have experienced redundancy, whether voluntary or not, and they're thinking, well, what do I do next? What advice would you have for them?
I'll go for number 2, and it has to go with my career path, is I'm a huge proponent of find out what drives your love and passion, right? What helps get you excited. For me, I can't do steady state. Don't give me a steady state job, a normal ops job. I will be bored and it doesn't work, right? I have to be learning. And I've learned that about myself. So I encourage everyone, figure out what that 1, 2 things that get you energized, from in HR, whatever the profession is you're in, and try to find roles in that, because then it becomes less about work and more about enjoying what you do. And when you do that, work becomes very easy.
Franz, I want to say thank you so much for coming on. This has flown by. It was like a blink. And I just feel excited about the future, which is rare. When people talk about the future today, there's rare excitement. So thank you so much for sharing so much. You're very kind.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And as always, it's a pleasure to be talking with you. Thank you, Vanessa.
Whether you're leading a business, shaping education, planning your next career move, or just starting out, you're part of a global conversation about how we learn, work, and grow. If you've enjoyed this episode, tap subscribe so you never miss the latest insights. And if you've a moment, leaving a quick rating really helps people find the show. For early access to new episodes, event invitations, and the chance to connect with others driving real change, join the community at globalskillspodcast.com. The future of skills belongs to all of us. Proudly sponsored by Abodu, empowering organisations and educators with world-class skills technology to build a better future for everyone.